Hi, my name is Michael Chikeen. The smartest people I've met have one common belief that us silly humans really don't know much. For example, we still don't know why planes stay in the air, or how Tylenol or even gravity works. Yeah, gravity. Look it up. In today's distracted, clickbait, misinformation age, I wish we could all be less certain, more humble, and a lot more curious. Admittedly, I've been known to struggle with all three. So, no more, no less, this show is my attempt to be that change. Thanks for joining me, and here we go. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to No More, No Less. I'm Michael Chikeen, and today in the virtual studio, I have with me Brendan Kwiatkowski. Is that right?
Pretty close. Kwiatkowski.
Kwiatkowski. Wow, not close at all. I found Brendan on Instagram producing reel after reel, speaking about his PhD research into the social emotional development of boys. Insight after insight, where his findings were so emotionally echoed in the comments by boys and men and the people who love them. And Brendan is an educator. He's a researcher, a speaker, specializing in the social emotional development and well-being of boys and men. His research spans multiple disciplines such as psychology, sociology, and education. He received his PhD in education from the University of Edinburgh, where he studied the emotions, masculinities, and schooling experiences of Canadian teenage boys. So today we're going to discuss Brendan's research so he can help all of us better understand what boys and men are currently facing in today's modern age and how all of us might be able to help. Brendan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Should have went over that last name before we started because that's a good one.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even feel like I say it right half the time.
I guess I wanted to start with because I know what people study and what they do their PhDs, and sometimes, especially in the social sciences, can be really personal. And so I was just curious, how did you find your way into that topic? Because you can tell that you're really passionate about it, and so I was wondering how you settled on what your thesis was going to be.
Yeah, on the surface level of that answer is I was a high school teacher and I was doing my master's in special education, came across, I really was interested in students who were diagnosed with emotional and behavioral disorders, in part because one of my favorite students had died from suicide the year before starting my master's. And another reason is that I found that teachers are the most negatively biased towards those type of students as opposed to any other type of special needs category. And part of the reason for that is that they think it's more of a classroom management issue, and it's really hard to have empathy for things that seem to go on inside someone's head. Like, for instance, teachers are generally way more accepting of being like, oh, someone's in a wheelchair, I can accommodate that. Whereas if it's like an internal emotional, behavioral, mental illness type thing, yeah, that's partly why they're the most negatively biased. And then I found out that 81% of those students in that category are male. And that really stood out to me. And I started researching, okay, how much is biology? How much is socialization and things like that? And then I led a program for grade 11 boys with diverse emotional behavioral needs. And that was a really powerful experience. And it kind of made me realize that a lot of the conversations around masculinity, which were increasing at that time I was doing my master's in the public sphere, how they were not capturing the complexity of the situation, most of the conversations around boys, men, and masculinity. And so for my PhD research, I really wanted to focus on like how important is the emotional expression of teenage boys to their development, and why are some boys emotionally restricted and some boys aren't. And then looking back at a deeper layer, because that's just the academic reasons, kind of how I got into this journey. But the deeper level is I've always just been interested in gender, grew up with a ton of gendered messages growing up in the church about like women, can women be pastors or not? Do they have spiritual authority or not? And so I was always just remember like hearing a ton of adults in my life debate gender roles, and not like the physical differences between men and women, but the more non-physical roles that men should be like this, women should be like that. And that was always interesting to me. And then at a deeper level, probably why I focus on teenage boys particularly is because one of the most important things I would want people to know about teenage boys is how lonely teenage boys are, and many of them feel in their experience. And that's not necessarily meaning they don't have friends. Some of them have tons of friends, but they still feel alone in their experience and want guidance and want direction. And I think there's a paucity of direction and guidance for boys and these days. And I was a teenage boy that was also lost and alone, even though I had lots of friends and I wouldn't look it from the outside. And so that's probably why I care about that age group particularly.
Wow, there's so much to unpack in that, because I remember my teenage years, um, and even though I was a single, an only child until about 16, uh, yeah, there were just always people around. There's always things to go and do. Luckily, I think only because my dad let me use the car. Otherwise, I would have been stranded.
Hmm.
But how do you think things are now? Is it because are boys more lonely now in their teenage years because of these online games where they're inside playing with these headphones on, and there's not that impetus to not want to hang out with your parents, so you leave the house and go to a party, or you go to a playground and have a beer and hang out? Like, what do you have you seen what's changed to make this epidemic of loneliness inside teenage boys today?
There's a collection of items. I think, yeah, a loneliness and aloneness are also two things to kind of prize apart. But technology is a, like most things, a tension paradox is that for a lot of the boys I talked to, video games were both an isolating thing, but also some of them had the only people in their lives that they've ever opened up to emotionally were guys that they played with online. Some of these people that they've never met in real life, but
Right.
they've opened up to people across the world that they played the same video games with. So it can be both a connecting and an isolating thing, and sometimes both at the same time for the same people. So I definitely think a huge shift, just what we see in schools around cell phones and mental health, is that a lot of the bullying happens through social media, and a lot of it happens even like outside of the school hours. So schools are having to deal with so much more cyberbullying and things that go on, and all those things kind of add to the detriment of mental health as well. And there's kind of like this tension of always being connected, but not necessarily being present in your connections and relationships. And so I don't ever want to like paint the past as some nostalgic place that didn't have issues as well. But another factor to look at is that there was more, this is context dependent, but
Mm-hmm.
more walkable, livable cities. There was less busyness overall in terms of both parents working, needing to work for the cost of living these days. And so there was more recreational time. There was more third places like to in hang out in joint areas that were more communal in nature. And so there's a lot of these different factors here, but I know that like for the specific recent history is that COVID did lead to tons of loneliness and aloneness as well, for teenage boys, well, for teenagers all around. And so yeah, those are some factors for loneliness, but loneliness has been, I guess, on the incline for the last 30, 40 years. About the amount of close friendships that adult males have has been going down quite drastically. So that 1 in 5 adult males says they have no close friend, not a single person to
Right.
talk to about that. And then we haven't talked even about like the masculinity piece, is that a lot of these boys, like the saddest thing for my PhD research is that all these boys I talked to were like, oh, I would love, one of them said, I would love to just talk to my male friends about more emotionally vulnerable things, even like once a year would be great. and they're all telling me that they want to open up a bit more to their male friends, but none of them think that any of their other male friends want to. And so there's this sense of like, oh, I'm alone in what I
Understand.
want, but they don't realize or recognize that all these boys are wanting very similar things.
Right. Have you in your research or prep for? Did you read Niobe Wei's work? I think it's Hidden Connections, or I can't remember what her
I've
book is
read
titled.
multiple articles and I've read one of her books, the it's not Secret Lives of Adolescent Males. I've read one of her books and almost all of her research articles.
Right.
I'm not sure about that book
Because
in particular.
yeah, it should be titled "The Secret Lives of Adolescent Males" because that's essentially what it alludes to. There's just so much data in that all these boys before they reach adolescence, they speak so eloquently and vibrantly about their male friendships. Like I don't know what I would do unless I had my friend to speak with. You need to let this stuff out. If you don't have to, you just explode. And like they just love their friends so much. It really spits in the face of all the things we think we know about men, that they're unemotional, that they don't need friendships, that they're these lone wolves or whatever. And then you see through her decade of research when the boys get to be late adolescence where it seems suicide peaks for boys, that's when they start subscribing to all these ideals of traditional masculinity, and they start becoming more separated. And like I don't think she ever really pinpointed, at least not specifically in her book, why exactly that happens, aside from like perhaps this is the idea of what we tell boys they have to become to be men. They have to be less emotional. You can't make yourself look like you're gay or a woman or whatever. And so I'm curious if any of your research echoed that, or if it was the opposite, or what sort of things that you found about how boys and adolescents aged and how their emotions might have changed.
Absolutely. The critical time period, I would argue, not just my research, but other research as well, is at the age of 13 to 15 is all the boys in my research who were grade 12 when I interviewed them said was the hardest time for them in terms of feeling the pressures to be man enough the most. So the pressure to restrict their emotions, the pressure to be cool, that was heightened around the end of elementary school and the start, grade 8 and 9 of high school. And there's a multiple factors going on. One is that there's also just puberty. So there's tons of changes
Right.
to their body, insecurities. Two, often moving to a bigger school is that you are a smaller fish in a larger pond. There's a lot more social posturing. And so when the social hierarchy is less stable, then unfortunately the common denominator usually is, especially amongst, to try keep your cards close, don't be an outlier, try to fit in. As one of the boys in my research said, yeah, it sucks to wear the mask of masculinity to suppress and not show what you actually kind of authentically are. But at the same time, you don't want to be the kid that nobody likes. And so that pressure, I would say grade 8 and 9 particularly is the hardest. Across the research, it's sometimes referred to as the second boy crisis that happens when boys get disconnected from parts of themselves. But of course, the trajectory of that is very interesting. Is like the reasons why did some boys um, resist those pressures or get back in touch with their emotional parts of themselves, and why did some continue on that journey? And that's why I interviewed the least emotionally expressive by grade 12 and the most emotionally expressive by the end of grade 12. And that's fascinating. And so then, if I to answer your question of Niobe Wei's research, is that the three main reasons why teenage boys start to restrict their emotions is for these reasons: fear of judgment from others, particularly their male peers, fear of burdening others. Often parents' divorce was a huge factor, but didn't have to be that. But it was just like, my parents are dealing with enough shit as it is. I don't want to add to their stress.
Right.
And kind of this sense of like, oh, being a man should be I should support other people. They shouldn't have to support me. I don't want to bring anyone down. So that is a huge message that's internalized. And then the last one wasn't related to masculinity at all. It was just, I called it a preemptive protection strategy from further pain, which is a long, complicated way to say they were emotionally close to people in their lives, and for some reason they experienced pain in that relationship, maybe through death, maybe just their best friend suddenly moving away to a different school, and they're like, oh, that sucks. I don't want to feel that pain of losing someone I'm close to again, so I'm not going to get emotionally attached to other people. And so those are the three main reasons. And we know there's a good case to be made that the three most harmful messages that are commonly associated with masculinity, although there's context here, is feeling the need to suppress your emotions, the need to um, be self-reliant, like don't ask for help from others, and the need to be dominant over others. And those can lead into so many different things, but I will always qualify that of saying context matters. Sometimes suppressing your emotions is survival, but really adaptive in your context. Even needing to be dominant, which, like, if you think there's a hierarchy that some people are better than others, I'm not saying that that's good, but it makes sense in some people's growing up situations or context. There is a dominance at play that maybe you would have been more beaten up if you weren't dominant yourself. And so much of learning what health is also unlearning and also giving space for why we learn some of these things that do have negative consequences, but having compassion for them, but also realizing, okay, maybe can I change and can I grow away from some of these restrictive messages that actually I didn't realize, but are hurting me and are hurting people around me.
Right. Yeah, because there's been just so much research out there that showed like men and boys that subscribe more to this traditional masculinity, this very narrow view of what a man should be, have like poorer mental health outcomes, more violent, suicide, and all these things. And so it seems that that's so proven, and we just trying to want to ignore it, And and I was going to say, I wonder if the the function, the institution of high school, how it is, at least in North America, is making that problem worse. I'd love to see like a performing arts high school and ask all the boys and men in there and see if it's the same idea. Because if you walk into any high school, at least Ontario, you're from BC, like sports was kind of the thing. And in the States, I'm sure it's 10 times worse. Where like the people valued are the popular kids, the kids that are doing sports, the kids that are on varsity, and all these things. And so this kind of supports the idea of that the ideal traditional boy or men are these guys. Whereas if you're in a school that maybe has a strong reputation for performing arts, then even your more creative uh, boys and even gay boys, gay teenagers, they have that sense of belonging, so that they don't have that fear of judgment. Do you have any insight on that, or because I've just thought of it now hearing it, that I wonder if is high school just really the worst?
It's not the worst for everyone, but I would say that, yeah, there's a lot of truth in that. It's a difficult minefield for almost every teenager. I do have insight into that because one of the schools I researched that took part in my research was exactly the type of school you described. And the interesting thing is that, yeah, it was less restrictive in some traditional ways, but there was other types of hierarchy within that school in terms of like which musicians were the more like I don't want to give too many details away about the school that was in my research, but
Okay.
there was still a hierarchy within just a different framework. And I would, from the outside, it seemed less restrictive than other high schools. They talked about how, or the boys that I interviewed from that school talked about how they do notice a palpable difference when they attend or visit another nearby, and they feel like they got to put on a bit more macho physical presence, which they didn't have to do
Huh.
at their artsy school. But
Right.
it's like one of the things. It's like I've talked to another school where they're having an issue with kind of very misogynistic teen boys, and it's from the ultimate frisbee team, which you think like the ultimate frisbee team, like that's not the football club. And it's like the same thing. Like I grew up as an athlete. Volleyball was my main sport, but sometimes like I was really respected for being an athlete in that sport. But also sometimes I heard comments like, "Well, that's the gayest out of all the sports too." And so there's always hierarchies, and those switch and they're context dependent.
Right. Well, I think we're always between men, unfortunately, and some women will keep this going as well. But mostly between men, you're always like, who's the more manly? Who's doing something that's gay? Is that a pink shirt? Like we become like gender enforcers from like age 5, and we do it in like ways that I don't think we even notice. But it's always a way for all men around us to kind of have to prove themselves.
Yeah.
It's so ridiculous. But it's really cool
Oh,
that you studied schools that were different to get that sort of idea.
yeah. In general, there's more similarities amongst teenage boys. Like the thing is, like my advisors, when I had to get my research approved, they're like, if you're interviewing, I had 170 grade 12 boys, and I ranked them, gave them surveys that exist and some other ones to determine their level of emotional expression. And then I interviewed groups from the most emotionally and the least, and they're like, if you're going on these extremes, like you might be concerned, or are you concerned about them being so different that like you're not really getting a good sense of the average teenage boy? And the thing that's really remarkable is how similar these extremes were. It's like we're not talking about so different creatures. The fact is, like all of the teenage boys in my research, they all felt the pressure and the need to restrict themselves, especially during the transition to high school and the first years of high school. And then
Mm-hmm.
some of them were able to be resilient to that and resist it ultimately. And some of them willingly adhered to those pressures, and some of them reluctantly adhered to those pressures.
Were there any indications for why some boys were able to resist that idea to put on that mask or to pretend that they're more men that they were? They just wanted to watch a musical or be in a school play, or was there any indication of why one would put on a show and others would just be themselves?
Yeah, I'll go through those three categories. So, first, those that ended up resisting, it was a self led process. They didn't like the internal conflict between what they felt was authentically them and what the pressures or the mask forced them to be like. And so they really just grew tired and discomforting of that. And so that ties in with the second factor, is that they had enough confidence to try and be more authentically themselves without fear, or with some fear perhaps, but their desire to be authentic outweighed their fear of fitting in.
Okay. And
And
yeah, I guess
so
it depends on the environment. If you have some really shitty environment with some specific bullies that are going to bully anybody that wears a salmon shirt to school, then I guess that will enforce that, I would imagine.
yeah, and that's why I think what's really fascinating is that what I've seen as a teacher and what I saw in my research is that generally by the later high school years, there's less, obviously bullying can still happen throughout, but there's less, like kind of there's more time for maturation and people themselves a bit alone. Like in grade 12, often teenagers talk about how like, we got kids I never hung out with because they weren't cool enough. It's kind of like, oh, they're cool in their own way, and there's a bit more maturation that happens by the late years that gives people a bit more freedom to be themselves. But at the same time, you have boys in my research who are like, yeah, in my 4 years of high school, I've started to forget about my super emotional self. And so you can start buying into the mask as being authentically you. And then this ties into those that reluctantly adhered. Those that reluctantly adhered did not like the masculine pressures, but they also, their fear of being alone and ostracized was from their friends. What was their biggest fear? That they,
Right.
yeah, they didn't think that they could be themselves without losing their friendships, and that mattered more to them, which makes sense. And then you have those that willingly adhered, and these were the category of boys that were like, this is what I need to do to become a man, so I don't view any incongruity between who I am and what these pressures are, because these pressures are telling me the way to be. And so, great, I have direction. I should be emotionally stoic, um, in all of these areas. And so, yeah, you have different levels and different categories of boys and why they do not or don't even want to resist.
Right. Well, let's go back to something you said earlier in our chat, where you said something like something that provoked you to want to go into this area of study was 81% or something of kids around this age that had either mental health problems or acting out problems. I can't remember what you said.
Diagnosed with emotional behavioral disorders.
Okay, and they were all boys, and so I wonder, because in what I how I think about this is that, is this because we're judging all boys around that age on the level of goodness on if they're acting like girls or not, like, or are these actually emotional disturbances that actually need some psychiatric help, or some actually some mental health attention,
Mm.
or like, are these just boys being boys?
I definitely think they're in need of support, but what you highlighted is really important, is that I think that stat is due to an overdiagnosis of boys as well as an underdiagnosis of girls. For instance, boys tend to display more externalizing behaviors, behaviors that act out, that get more notice and attention from teachers, and girls tend to have more internalizing behaviors, more withdrawnness, and this equally harms boys and girls, because girls are being missed, because girls are more expected and are more compliant often in school to be studious, do what the teacher tells you to do. And so if they're just withdrawn, they're not causing a fuss, the non-squeaky wheel doesn't get the grease. And then sometimes the boys who have more externalizing behaviors do get the grease, but not necessarily the attuned grease that they need. Sometimes that gets misapplied as well. So I think it goes both
Interesting.
ways.
So if I'm understanding correctly, so if boys are acting out because they are depressed, or they're, excuse me, or they're anxious, or etc., they're just treated like they're misbehaving and they're angry. Maybe they get expelled, like all of these things. Whereas if a girl would have done it, she would get more care and nurturing and attunement. Is that right? To
Not
be really clear.
necessarily. The girl, if because girls tend to do more internalizing behavior, they just get missed.
Right. But
Um,
I'm saying if they were to act out in some way, that they would be treated like, oh, maybe something's wrong, and they get attunement and care, where boys get maybe suspended.
I don't know if I would say that, because there's also a number of things that if a girl acts out, um, and to be honest, like the rate of girls acting out aggressively in schools is increasing over time.
Hmm.
So yeah, I won't say that because I don't know enough research to confidently say what people's reactions are to girls acting out. I know that sometimes it can go both ways. Sometimes yes, they might get more care or more, but also I could see them getting more judgment because that's more improper for a girl to act out as, and so
Right. That's fair.
it's
Yeah, because I've seen some study that said, like, under the same circumstances, a lot more boys will get suspended and reprimanded for the exact same things as girls in high school, for example. And I don't think anyone knows why that is. If it's because the bias towards caring for girls and punishing boys, or because teaching is mostly a female dominated profession, and so you're going to look at boys as being aggressive when maybe they're just
mm.
sad and frustrated, or all of these things. But it
Yeah, I
seems like
definitely think that can be the case, especially in elementary school, where the disproportion, like this is one of the beautiful things about diversity, why diversity is needed, is because you can learn from other experiences. And so the fact that I think in Canada it's around 73% of teachers are female or women teachers, but I know that like 3% of kindergarten teachers are male. Um, and when you, yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from each other. And I think that sometimes, like, not like I don't want to paint that boys and girls are so different, because once again, they have much more in common than not. And there's more variance within genders than between genders. But I think like learning, that's like why my research talking about teenage boys is like learning the worlds of boys is important to understand, just like it's important to learn the world of non-binary people or women as well and girls as well, because there's different flavors and different notes that can help you when you have a relationship with them, that can help you better understand the things that they're going through. Because I know, like I was a science teacher, I've been around a lot of women and have a lot of candid conversations. I know a lot about periods and the menstrual cycle, but I don't know that in a inherent way. I do want to try one of those buzzing things. So I think that there's a lot for us to learn from different experiences. And I do think that sometimes schools do not, yeah, fully understand some boys.
Right. Yeah. I know. This is a very nuanced topic because you definitely can't paint with black and white lines here. And so, yeah, I want to echo that's it's clearly obvious to I think most people paying attention that there are more things in common between the genders than there are difference, and so it's important to respect the great differences and just the general differences that we have without thinking that we're completely different species, which is
Mm-hmm.
kind of silly. But I was something you said. So you said so boys will act out externally normally around those ages, and girls are normally keeping to themselves and it'll be more internal. It seems like after in adulthood that kind of switches, whereas they say depression is more highly um, documented in women because women are saying, you know, I'm sad, they're going to go to therapy, they're talking to their friends, etc., whereas boys or men go a lot more insular, they stay by themselves, they never get therapy and all of these things. Would you have any insight to why that might be? Like are they really just assuming these gendered roles, or like why does it switch like that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it switches, um, but I understand the paradox here. The paradox is
Yeah.
that yes, boys have more externalizing behaviors that kind of grab attention, um, but that whole time, it's like the externalizing behaviors are almost like an overflow of what's going on inside, and the
Right.
burdening of not wanting to burden other people and feeling like I need to be self-reliant, I'll figure it out myself, is like that's that you're seeing described throughout, is that yes, maybe as they mature they're externalizing behavior. Well, you do still have um you can still have blow ups. Like I know a lot of men or a lot of boys that I talked to actually were like really afraid of their anger. They didn't understand their anger, and but they didn't want it to explode, but they didn't really know what to do with it, and so they would just kind of keep it inward. So I guess that's maybe the thing that I got to figure out a clear way to say is that yes, more externalizing behaviors, but anger is often like the secondary emotion because there's stuff going on inside that is kept close to the chest, and that does carry on through adulthood of men not seeking help or of men not even knowing that something is really wrong. Like one of the boys I talked to had just come out of the hospital after a suicide attempt, and he said he didn't realize that he had been depressed for the last 4 years. He said he's like, I just thought it was puberty, that something was going on. I didn't realize what it was. I was like, maybe this is just what everyone else goes through. Didn't want to burden anyone. Didn't want to be judged for it. Didn't want to be thought of as weak. And so he didn't talk to anyone about it. And it wasn't until things got like life and death, that he fortunately would realize, oh, there's more going on here. And so he would have presented as a happy, like one of the things I talked about is like a lot of these boys wanted to present themselves as happy, fun-loving guys. And there's a disconnect when you force boys to disconnect from the emotional parts of themselves. You have these compartmentalizations where you might have externalizing behaviors, but you have all of these inner, deep, rich emotional worlds and feelings that they may not know how to get space from or how to unpack that throughout their lives.
And so, how from all the research you've seen and all the boys you've spoken to and taught and researched, where can we start to undo all this damage that we seem to be doing? I don't know if it's society based or
Mm.
like it does seem to be more pronounced in religious areas like the church, as you were kind of alluding to. But how overall, how can we start to help these boys from the outset? Were you able to establish any of that through your work?
Wasn't the focus of my interviews, but I have tons of thoughts on that from my other research I've done. It was like, this is kind of a disappointing answer, but one is we got to start with ourselves. Because teenage boys, I guess this actually was from my research, is that teenage boys cared very little about what they were taught and told about masculinity or emotions. They cared what they were shown and what they observed the people, the adults in their lives, actually their relationships with emotions and masculinity and things like that. So all of us, I think, male role models, adult males in their lives have maybe more of an onus, but it's not limited to just adult males, is that we need to work on ourselves. We need to reassess some things that we grew up learning and unlearn them, but also help have more intentional demonstrations with the teenage boys, with the younger boys in our lives. And so that's like a starting place, which I know is, I always feel like it's kind of disappointing. Like you got to start with yourself first, which I do think though
Well,
is very true.
well, to stop a second, I don't think it's disappointing. I think it's one of those things like it's simple, but it's not easy. It's
Mm.
like saying the whole like if you want to lose weight, eat less and move more. Okay, that could be the answer, but it's not easy. It's like, well, why do you eat more? Why can't I move more? Like there's so much that goes into that simplicity, because from if I'm understanding you correctly, it's that if we don't love ourselves enough, then we can't love the men and boys around us enough, or people in general enough. And then they see that we can't do that. They think that that's how they have to be, and it becomes this brutal cycle that continues. Is that about right?
Yeah, it definitely can. And I think what continues the cycle more than anything is the lack of intentionality about these topics. Like, for instance, I'm not sure if you saw one of the posts I did about people tend to think that boys are easier to raise than girls, especially during the teenage years because they are seen as less emotional. And my research totally contradicts that. That the most emotionally restricted teenage boys I talked to were very emotionally aware. They opened up tons to me. Arguably, they opened up more to me than the most emotionally expressive, probably because they didn't have as many people in their lives, or didn't think they had as many people in their lives to talk to. But these aren't the stereotypical emotionally ignorant or just non-emotional teenage boys that so many people think of. They're very sensitive to the emotions of other people as well as themselves, even if they need help in guidance in managing their own emotions. But the kind of I do talks on different topics, and kind of how some of the most important areas I think to prize apart is like, what are the stories that we've learned about emotions? What's our relationship with emotions? What are the stories we've learned about our relationship with masculinity? And then what are stories in our relationships with our father figures? And for what is our relationship with our mother figures? Kind of being four key areas for introspection to discuss. And I think what's hard is that most teenage boys aren't going to be like, hey, mom and dad, I want to talk about this. Can you show me guidance in this area? But the fact is that they feel alone, that they will appreciate, even if from a distance, an openness, a lack of judgment to talk about things. And so one of the things that I recommend is something I call masculinity vaccinations, which is um,
That's
I don't know
genius.
how that sounds, but I
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of borrowed the term from Dr. Becky Goodenside, a parenting expert, who talks about anxious kids giving them emotional vaccinations. So you tell them about what's going to come before they go through something anxious so that it's less anxious in the moment. And I think
Okay.
that for preteen, teenage boys, we should be having conversations that kind of tell them, hey, you know what? When you go to high school, like here are some dynamics that are going to be going on. You're probably going to feel the need to kind of restrict who you are, especially at school amongst friends. There's going to be a lot of social posturing of who's the most cool. And I would just love to hear your thoughts on that because, just so you know, there's a lot, maybe this won't be you, but there's so many teenage boys out there who feel really alone in their experience and they think that they're the only ones going through it, but that's actually the case. All the research shows this, and basically kind of showing them the cards as to, hey, teenage boys are going through this crisis. Here's kind of what it looks like, and kind of preparing them for it. And I would say, like, if I could choose, if I could wave my wand and have like, well, no, I think I would choose different wishes. But one of the wishes I would choose is that for every person to have like one close friend that they can have as an emotional safe haven, that they can talk about the things they need to talk without judgment and with like full safety.
Right. What's that lady that talked about emotional vaccination? What's her
Dr.
name?
Becky Good Inside is her brand.
Good inside. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, because I think that's the main thing. Like, just I was thinking about it as you were saying these boys really opened up to you when they had these interviews, and I think everyone, this isn't a gender thing, but boys especially, if they feel that there's someone that actually cares what they're feeling, what they're going through, which you seem to have been that outlet for a lot of these boys that were interested and wanted to study them. What do you feel? Then it seems like you've just unlocked this gigantic dam that's been up for so long that they're happy to talk about it with whomever. And I think I really want to focus in what I want to write about is that how much we underuse and undervalue male friendships. Like we're all posturing, we're all saying, oh, those shoes are gay, or oh, you can't lift that weight, you're a girl, like all these things, and we think that's the price of friendships, or that we have to drink together or do all these things. Where like the minute someone just starts asking someone, so how are you? Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. You broke up with that girl. Like, are you okay? Like, men soften because they just want to feel that someone actually cares. Like, is that some of the things you've seen in your interviews, or were there men that were just, or boys that just refused to talk about emotional stuff?
I assumed that might be the case, but no, none of them. I thought some of them would just be like, I've always been this way. I'm just emotionally stunted or just emotionally flat. But none of them said that. They all remembered exactly when or the time period of when and why they started to restrict their emotions. And they were all quite open with me. And I think that, yeah, what we know about trauma, what we know about healing is like being seen is such an important human experience. And being heard is also really valuable. And those are some of the most preventative factors for something not being received in your body as traumatic. Is that if you feel alone in a situation, it's way more likely that that might become a traumatic somatic experience in your body. Whereas if you have a community, you have friendships that are safe, that you can open up with and be vulnerable. Doesn't mean all the time, but
Right.
the, like, and
We
that's
don't we don't. So I was gonna say we don't have to be like groups of female friends that will just get together every weekend and have a wine and like talk about their feelings. Like I'm being very stereotypical, but you know what I mean. Whereas in like men, yeah, every couple months you can get together and be like, hey, like how are things with your wife? Like this
Yeah,
doesn't
it
have
doesn't
to
have to
be
look a
every
certain
day.
way.
Right.
But what's important, though, where I would challenge boys and men, is
Mm-hmm.
that most of the boys and men I've ever talked to would like 100% want to show up for their male friends if they knew their male friend was going through something.
Right.
So they would all want, but they also all said that like they don't want to do that and burden their friends. And so it's like, okay, so you wouldn't judge your friends doing it to you, but you're judging yourself if you were to do it to them. And so like you should open up a bit more than you think you are. And like it's so hard because as soon as you start opening up, you also open up yourself to hurt and pain, and that's why vulnerability is awesome and it sucks.
Right. It's hard because you have to accept how awful those feelings are. But in my experience, at least, in that acceptance comes the ability to make change. Because if you're not accepting it, you can't really do anything. Like one of my closer friends, when he was going through a tough time with his wife several years ago, I was trying to, because you could tell he was really suffering, and I was like, what's going on? And he's like, well, man, I don't want to talk about it. Our relationship's all fun and stuff like that. I don't want to bring you down. I'm like, I go, what are we friends for then? Like if we're just having jokes and going for a drink and whatever, like those jokes are great, but like if you're going through something, the fact that I can see it dripping off of you and you don't want to talk about it, well then like this is what our friendship is actually for. And it
Mm-hmm.
kind of it kind of changed how we relate to each other ever since then. But I've heard it from other friends of friends that are going through stuff, and someone saying, oh yeah, they think they can deal with it on their own. And it is the saddest thing, and it seems like that's kind of where you landed after all of your research with all these boys, that like everyone is together, yet everyone feels alone, and they don't have to. Is that kind of what you came away with?
That is of the boys that are emotionally restricted, yes, absolutely. And the boys who are emotionally expressive have ventured out there and have found their emotional safe havens and they've found the joys and the benefits of that community. And that's why they love it.
Right. So it's even the boys that are more expressive. I guess the simplicity that we could tell to men listening to this, or boys, or if you have boys in your life that you're guiding, would you say the simplest answer is just go out and be curious and try to find people that will let you be who you are? Like just try to find your group.
A lot of people that I talked to did realize they had to change their friend group in order to do that. But another strategy would just be like if you have a group of friends, like don't harder to open up into in a group because everyone's going to still be posturing and they might be more likely to downplay it. But like one on one, um, I don't know if this will work for people, but one of the boys who was more emotionally expressive, he said that it's still kind of awkward for him every time. So him and his friends, they just play a game and then they start opening up and the game is like never have I ever. And so he told me sometimes they do like never have I ever felt suicidal. And then that is like the game that brings up the conversation
Whoa, that's a ballsy never have I ever.
that I know.
That kid, whoever said that kid's parents are therapists. He's going around trying to help everybody.
Yeah, definitely not the case with this individual.
Wow.
But I think that
Okay.
just speaks to teenagers in general. I think we underestimate them and we also over expect them. We over expect them to have things figured out and to be emotionally regulated, and we underestimate the types of conversations that they need to have and want to have.
So how could parents and even men, how could we no, I don't have kids, but like how could these people reach out to the boys and men in their life that they think might be suffering but think they're a burden? Like how do you approach people like that to get them to feel safe and to open up and to kind of let some steam off of the pot, if you will?
Generally, you don't go ask them, hey, do you need to talk? Or I think you might be depressed. definitely don't do that. I would say the main thing is relationships. Like start with the plan. Hey, I don't know, do something that's authentic to you. To an extent, will be easier. Of going for hikes or paddle boarding depends on your relationship, obviously, with these individuals. But it's really hard to do anything unless you have some relationship there first. And I know that this is a generalization, but a lot of guys talk best side to side, or they'll do like a whole round of golf together and then talk at the very end of it about something a bit more personal. So, like, how are you doing after they hung out for like 5 hours together? And then they'll
Right.
have like a vulnerable conversation at the end.
Yeah, that's good. I think we should be more alert. Like if we and like you alluded to, and I agree. I think all men have this really deep well of emotion, and that they don't feel that they can ever tap because they're not allowed to. So I would say to like everyone out there, my experience, like just have an ear open, and if a friend says something that like that happens to escape that they're having a hard time with their wife or girlfriend or family, like just hear them and ask them another question. Just be curious, and because I think sometimes there's so much steam in that pot of life. Even if someone doesn't want to take a lid off or let some steam out, some just escapes because the pressure's just building up way, 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 way too much. And I guess so for because I know you have to go. Um, what are your because I saw your website and it seems like you're so passionate about this, and as I mentioned before this call, all your reels are so great on Instagram. I think it's re dot masculinity or masculine.
Massive. Yeah,
R
remasculine is
R E.
kind of the my brand, I guess.
Okay, and then what re dot masculine on Instagram, and you have all these really heart centered reels that I think are helping so many boys and men just see that yeah, we are really caring, and we do want to help each other. And so, what do you plan to do moving forward with all of this, goodwill that I think you seem like that you want to give back?
Yeah, I'm definitely not interested in just academia. I don't really care about academia in this time unless it's actually practically doing changes, because I think change is really needed. And I don't think anyone, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, is like content with how things are regarding issues pertaining to boys, men, and masculinity. So I want to create more resources. Um, Definitely, I seem to have a following right now, primarily of parents of boys and teen boys that want practical supports, especially during the teenage years. So I'm working on a couple ideas around that, and I'm creating programs and consulting regarding programs that different institutions, sectors, um, are curious about and interested in working with boys and men particularly. And so, yeah, I'm doing university teaching, but I'm actually going to be moving more into consulting and developing practical resources and strategies that can get in the hands of people.
Amazing. Well, thanks for all you do, and thanks for being here. I hope people listening got a little more insight that like all men are emotional beings, and I think we should be treated like that, and hopefully we can continue to treat each other like that. So thanks a lot for your research and your time.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it.
So thanks for listening to No More, No Less. I appreciate the time you spent with me today. So please subscribe and rate the show if you enjoyed it. It'll help me create more amazing content and get that next little bit of validation that I so deeply crave. If you did enjoy it, well, that sucks. But to make sure, I think you should listen to my next 10 episodes and then decide. I mean, come on. Rome was not built in a day. I'm just getting warmed up here, guys. So thanks again. See you next time.